This is the first of two chapters where we look at information and IT. Now, information and IT between them make up 15% of the syllabus, so you can expect to see them examined in every paper, possibly as a full question or maybe as part of a question. It is an area that the examiner has consistently said candidates perform very badly in, so it's something you need to pay attention to, make sure you understand the basics of, so that criticism doesn't apply to you. In this chapter, we take a high-level view of information strategy and systems. So rather than start off by looking at IT and looking at the technology side, we start off by thinking about the commercial issues and why organizations need information. Why is it important for their success? Having identified why information is important and what information they need, we then look at the different aspects of information strategy, which is how they get information. So having identified what information they need, how are they going to make sure they get it? To do that, we will look at the different types of information system that are around. Bit of recap here from E1, but it's also material you need to be familiar with for this paper. And then we'll look at some of the issues around the value and cost of information, because it's very important to be able to judge what information is actually important and therefore carries a value, and how this matches against the cost taken to obtain it, because IT systems and the like very rarely come cheap. We'll then look at organizing the IT function, some of the issues around what you do with your IT function, and in particular the issue of outsourcing and shared service centers, both of which are very popular approaches to IT. We'll look at what they are, how they can be a benefit, and what additional risks they raise. So let's start off by thinking about what information actually is. There's actually quite a few definitions around, but for our purposes, we will treat information as data which has gone through some sort of analysis. So what we're thinking about here is input, process, output, systems thinking that you'll first have come across in E1. So in this example, your input is data. Data is just stuff, things like lists, bits and pieces that don't really have any value as yet. So for example, let's say your data is a list of transactions. So you're running a business, let's say you're involved in a shop, and you've got a list of transactions, a list of things that you've bought, and a list of things that you've sold, and other bills that you've paid, and that's all in an Excel spreadsheet or written down somewhere. Now that list of transactions may have some value to someone running the business. They might perhaps be able to pick out the larger transactions, but it's going to be a very, very limited use. So what you're going to do to make it useful is you're going to put it through some sort of management accounting system. Now this system might be management accounting package, might be a software package, it might be something you do on an Excel spreadsheet, it could even be manual. You can do this stuff manually and write it all up if you like. But each of those is some sort of management accounting system, looking at debits and credits and so on. And what you get out at the end of a management accounting system is a set of management accounts that shows your turnover, your cost of sales, your overheads and all the rest of it. Now that set of management accounts is information. That is useful stuff, meaningful stuff, that someone can use to help them manage the business. So that's what we mean by data, that's what we mean by information. It's that sort of process that happens in lots of different areas. Another example would be the way in which Google takes loads and loads of data about what people are searching for and what they're clicking on and where they go on to click, and turns that into a list of results that tend to be very, very accurate when you type search terms into Google. That's taking data, taking loads and loads of stuff about what people do and turning it into useful information. Now, organizations need information, and where they need to start in assessing information is with their corporate strategy. Lots of that in E3, so you'll be familiar with what we mean by corporate strategy. How is the organization going to achieve its goals? And in particular, they're going to want to think about the critical success factors, concept you've come across many times, I'm sure. Remember, critical success factors are the things valued by customers that are particularly important if you're going to succeed in achieving your goals. Or to put another way, they are factors which are critical to your success. In lecture example 1, we introduce a fictional organisation that we're going to use as a basis of case studies throughout this chapter. That way we can help you show how important it is to apply knowledge, and that it helps you to think about these issues in the context of a particular organisation, because that's how you're going to be tested about it. So the fictional organisation is called D. It's a courier company that operates in 20 countries with 400,000 employees and so on. Very competitive market, we're told, as indeed the courier business is in the real world too, and the board have said they've got a strategic aim of growing the business by increasing market share. So that's what their strategy is, that's what they're trying to do. So just as a starting point, before we think specifically about their information needs and how they're going to get it, let's think about the possible critical success factors for D. So if you're a courier company, what do you think are the things that your customers particularly value that you're going to have to get right if you're going to be successful in increasing your market share? So press pause, have a think about ideas on critical success factors, and then press play when you're ready for the debrief. So what do we think the critical success factors are? If you're a customer of one of these courier companies, what is it you're particularly going to want to see which might make you come back and use that company for your business again? Well, it's going to include things like reliable pickups. If you book a courier delivery, you are going to want the courier to come and collect your goods at the time they say they will. If they don't do that, then you can't really work with them because it'll just throw your timing out of whack. You want them to deliver on time, so deliveries to arrive when they say they will, but also in good condition. So particularly if you're transporting anything remotely fragile or breakable, you need it to arrive where it's meant to be, not having been broken or damaged in any way. You're going to want low prices. So for D, that means they're going to have to keep their cost base down in order to be able to charge low prices. It's a very competitive market, remember. There are going to be others who are competing on price. You're going to want to have efficient routes. So if you have a load of deliveries to make, you're going to have to plan your route to be as efficient as possible, because that's going to keep your costs down. And it's also going to help with delivering on time, so you can do it all as efficiently as possible. You're also going to have good service from your staff. So the staff who customers deal with need to be polite, they need to be helpful, they need to be well informed, whether that's the drivers making the delivery, people doing pickups, customer service staff who they ring up and speak to, whoever. So this is the sort of thing you're going to be looking at for critical success factors, and maybe you can already see that at least some of these will lead on to certain specific information requirements. So that's why it's so important to identify this at the outset. What is it we really need to get right? Then we can think specifically about the information that's going to help us do that. As we've already mentioned, if you're going to use information to deliver on your CSFs and succeed in your strategy, you need an information strategy. You need to plan this out. You need to think about it. It's not just going to happen by itself. And there are three aspects to an information strategy. This is also covered in E3. It could be and has been tested in either paper, so it is an area of overlap. First aspect is an information system strategy, or the IS strategy, and that is about defining the information needs of the business. So what information are we actually looking for? It's the what. What do you want to do? What information do we need? Second aspect is your IT strategy, information technology strategy. So having decided what you want to do, this is how are you going to do it? So in practical terms, what equipment are you going to invest in? What are you actually going to buy? Who are you going to partner with in order to meet those information needs? What are you actually going to spend money on? And then the final aspect is information management strategy, your IM strategy, which is actually about the people side and how the information is going to be stored and managed, who's going to have access to it, what's your security you're going to have in place, what sort of operating procedures you're going to have in place. So who is going to use these systems and data, and how are they going to use it? And you need to deal with all three aspects in order to have a coherent information strategy. Now, one aspect of this that has been tested in the past is to ask the question, well, why bother? Why is it important? Does it matter if you have an information strategy or not? So have a think about that. Have a think about why it's important to have an information strategy. And some of these points are very generic, but see if you can think about D in particular, particularly if that helps. You think about this courier company, multinational, very competitive market. We've thought about what their critical success factors are. Why is it that they need to have an information strategy? How would you sell this process to them? So press pause, write down your ideas, and then press play when you're ready to continue. So why is it important for D to have an information strategy? There are various possibilities here, but here are some ideas. So one reason why it may be important is because it actually gives you a competitive advantage in terms of your dealings with customers. So it may be very important to have access to certain types of information or make it available from a customer point of view. And an example of something like the courier business would be tracking online. It's pretty much standard now for courier companies to allow their customers to log into the website at any time and track where their package is. So they're not going to be able to do that unless they have an information strategy that says, right, this is what we want, this is how we're going to achieve it. So it may be that the strategy and delivering on it can give you a competitive advantage. It will hopefully reduce the risk of waste, because as we've already mentioned, technology is very, very expensive on the whole. It's likely to be a large item of spending, and therefore you need to think very carefully about how you're going to spend it. You need to have a strategy to reduce the risk that you waste money and spend it on things that aren't really useful to the business. It means you can focus your spending and your efforts on the critical aspects of the business. Remember, we have identified the critical success factors. We've identified the things that the business really needs to get right. So it makes sense that any spending and any management focus should really focus on those areas. You can do that by having a strategy in place that is driven by your CSFs. It's very hard to do otherwise. It's partly because pretty much everyone uses IT. In a courier company, the drivers will have handheld devices that allow them to tell them where they need to be going and allow them to track deliveries. Customer service staff will have access to databases. Everyone's going to use IT, so it's critical for the organization to run well that you get the IT right, that you think about it carefully and make sure it works. So that's why you don't just let this happen, it's why you think about it, you develop a strategy before you get going with information and IT. It's important to appreciate that, like many things, information requirements are going to be very different at different levels of the organization. So the top level, strategic management, so we're thinking here senior management, thinking board of directors, they have responsibility to look at the organization as a whole, take the big decisions. Do we make an acquisition? Do we go into certain markets? What's our pricing strategy going to be? They are going to have certain information needs that are going to be different from tactical management, sort of middle management, people who run departments, people who run divisions. They are going to be implementing the decisions of strategic management, so they're going to be putting them into practice and make sure that their department is actually running smoothly day to day. So they're going to need to be checking on the performance of their particular business unit. And then at operational management level, it's this sort of supervisory level, people may be managing a team or managing a small function. They need to control the day-to-day activities of the organization, so make sure that things are being reconciled, that records are being kept the way they should be. So each of these people will have different levels. So for the next lecture example, think about D, think about the managers at D, think about, well, okay, for each of these levels, what information are they going to want? What are they going to need in order to carry out their jobs properly? Again, some of this will apply to any organization, so think about those points, but also think about specifically for a courier company, what is it that's going to be important at each level? Press play when you're ready to go on. So what information will the board of directors and other senior managers really want to see? Well, they will look for things like the overall size of the market, because that will allow them to work out, approximately at least, what is the market share of their business? How well are they doing in that respect? If there's a fall in sales for D, then does that reflect a contraction in the market as a whole, or are they losing share to competitors? Because the way you'd respond to that would be very, very different. They'll also want to know if it's growing or shrinking, because that will affect some of the strategic decisions around maybe investment or expansion that they'd want to make. They would want information about, for example, key customers. Some of your customers in this business will probably be very large corporates. So what are their needs? What are their expectations? Are they expecting, for example, to be able to book online more easily? Are they really focused on price? What is it they're really looking for? That's going to be something to be considered by senior management. They're going to want information on competitors. They're going to want to know what their competitors are doing. What are they doing in terms of pricing? Where do you stand in relation to your competitors? What are they doing in terms of new services? Are they offering logistics management, for example, to their customers, and should we respond to that? And you're going to look for information about things like technology capabilities. What is it that you should really be aware of as a senior management team that technology can do? Technology changes all the time. Something like the courier business, they use a lot of handheld devices that are becoming more and more powerful. Senior management need to know about that so they can make decisions about what they should be investing in and what direction they should go in. Now, at tactical level, if you're running a division, running a business unit, then very often one of the really critical bits of information is your budget. So what targets are you being set financially, and what is your actual performance? And that usually is your key management tool. How are we doing against our targets? Do we need to take corrective action? Is there anything we particularly need to focus on? And as well as financial targets and financial performance, you might also want information about non-financial indicators. It may be that you use the balanced scorecard, for example, and you're going to want data about customer satisfaction, customer retention, new products, or something like that. You might also want to monitor things like capacity of the system. So what is the capacity of your delivery system, and how far is it being utilized? Are you really using it to the fullest effect, or should you perhaps be cutting your prices so you can utilize it more fully? You might want to look at routes as well. You want to check that the routes being taken really are the most efficient possible. To remember, that is one of your critical success factors, to make sure you make your deliveries on time and keep your costs down as far as possible. And then operational management, those who are in supervisory positions, what sort of information are they going to need? Well, the really critical bits of information are going to be things like schedules. So what is your schedule for pickup and for delivery? You are going to need to make sure that you have people ready to make those pickups, you have people ready to make those deliveries. And the other side of that equation is going to be staff availability. So you need to know how many staff you have, how many are on holiday, how many are sick, and therefore you can make sure they're deployed to get those deliveries done on time. You might well be monitoring daily or weekly volumes as a sort of leading indicator of business. That's something you'll have access to very quickly. And you might well be in the front line for things like customer complaints as well, and feedback. Because if customers do have complaints, they're probably going to go to the sort of operational manager on duty. So the operational manager is going to need that information so they can act on it, they can deal with the problems arising, and if there are big issues, they can feed it further up the line so that they can be dealt with. So hopefully you can see that's just beginning to think about all the different types of information that management would need, see how it differs at each level, and having applied that to a courier company, hopefully you'd be able to think about that in relation to any other company, given a bit of background information, because you could be given any situation in the exam in a scenario. You need to be able to think through what information is really, really critical here before possibly then going on to think about how are they going to get it. So far, we've analysed D's information needs. What sort of things are they going to look for in order to be able to achieve their strategy? Now, for any organisation, apart from maybe very, very small ones, meeting those information needs is going to involve IT. It's going to involve investment in some sort of technology. There's a variety of different systems you can invest in. You might invest in perhaps a number of these to meet different needs, but you do need to be aware of these for P3. Again, hopefully you've come across these in E1, but just to remind you what they all are. So at the bottom of the hierarchy for most information systems, we have transaction processing systems. So these actually collect the information about business transactions, so the sort of raw data that we were talking about at the start of the chapter. You then have management information systems. They pull information from the TPS, from the transaction processing system, and then present it in a way that managers can actually use for decision making. We'll look at examples of each of these shortly, by the way. The examiners quite often talk about ERP systems, so Enterprise Resource Planning Systems, and this is a system that goes across the whole enterprise. So you'll have an HR module, a purchasing module, a finance module, and so on. It will all be compatible with each other. You can do analysis with all of it. As you might imagine, they're big, they're complicated, they're expensive, but they can also be very, very useful. You have strategic enterprise management systems, and these are used to help you with strategic decisions across the organization, so where you're going to allocate your resource and so forth. It's particularly linked with activity-based management, which you'll have come across previously. So if you're thinking about costings relating to certain activities, where you're going to prioritize and focus, it's going to capture data that's relevant for that. Decision support systems used to, as the name implies, assist decision making, so look at scenarios, look at different variables, and help people make day-to-day decisions. And then executive information systems, quite often referred to as a dashboard, which is data presented usually at a very high level for senior managers. What is the information that they really need to know? So summarizing the information from all the other systems. And you also get expert systems, which take information, lots and lots of information, and then develop rules to actually make business decisions. With perhaps the best known example of this being something like credit scoring or insurance pricing that's done in an automated way, applying rules to certain bits of information. So now that we've talked about each type of system in general, let's have a go at thinking about what that might mean for D and what sort of systems they might be using. Now, some of these answers are going to be a bit generic, but see if you can make your answers as specific as possible to D, to a courier company in a competitive market and so on, because that skill of making your answers very specific, bringing in as much of the scenario as you can, is critical at this level. So have a go at identifying one or two examples of each type of system for the courier company, and then press play when you're ready to continue. So what sort of transaction processing systems would D use? Well, what are the fundamental transactions for D? They are deliveries. So the absolute basic thing they'd want a system to do is to track deliveries. They would need to know when goods have been picked up, when they've been delivered. And that's going to be the fundamental building block. They're also, of course, going to have financial transactions. They will need a system that tracks billings to customers, invoices they need to pay for suppliers, and salaries that are likely to be a pretty major cost as well. So those will all be tracked using transaction processing systems. What about management information systems? Well, the key point here is that management information systems are all about reporting. So the management information systems at D will draw information from the transaction processing systems to look at things like volume of deliveries. Management will want reports on delivery volumes, delivery accuracy. Was it delivered to the right place and on time? They'll want financial reporting, actual versus budget, which is something an MIS very often does. So those are the sort of pieces of information being aggregated and presented to management to help them run the business. Might they have an ERP system? Well, they might. If they want to integrate everything from across the company, that will allow them to do reporting on things like balanced scorecard measures. That might mean drawing in data, or would certainly mean drawing in data from across the organization, maybe looking at performance by customer. So seeing how much they billed each customer, what sort of margins they're making, whether deliveries for those customers have been accurate, and so on. Might they use strategic enterprise management systems? Well, this is all, remember, all about identifying added value, identifying where you're adding value in the organization and therefore where you should be investing. So it might help you make strategic decisions like, do we invest in new vehicles so that we can maybe deliver quicker and more efficiently, or possibly do we invest in systems that do better tracking, which would really add value to our customers. Strategic enterprise management system might help you to make those sorts of decisions. Then when we think about decision support systems, actually the most commonly used decision support system in many organizations is Microsoft Excel, very familiar to a lot of accountants, and D, like many organizations, might use Excel to do things like create budgets. It allows you to do scenario planning, very flexible, and for the same reasons you might use it to do investment appraisal. So when you're thinking about, do we buy a new fleet of trucks, you can look at costs and benefits, you can try and maybe do an NPV analysis on what sort of savings you'll make through having more efficient vehicles or something like that. Might you have an executive information systems? Well, yes, you might have a dashboard for your senior management looking at the really high-level measures. The idea of an executive information system is that senior management can come in the morning, turn on their computer, and they will see the indicators for the maybe 6 to 10 key measures that they feel are really important for running the business. A bit like your car dashboard shows you the critical things about what's going on in your car. So that might be measures like perhaps market share, deliveries on time, maybe repeat business. How many people are coming back to you having used you before? Those would be the critical things you'd have thought that senior management would want to know if their business is operating effectively. And what about expert systems that can actually make decisions using simple rules? Well, some courier companies use expert systems to work out the most efficient routes for their deliveries. Now, this can be done quite easily based on distance using mapping software, but the really sophisticated software nowadays will also take into account not just location, but things like the weather and traffic. There are various ways of monitoring how heavy traffic is in certain areas, and the state-of-the-art stuff will be able to recalculate your route to avoid the worst of the traffic. So that's how all of these systems might be used by D. Remember, critical exam skill, you should be able to do this sort of thing for any organization that you're given to talk about in a scenario. We've already talked about how information systems, and IT in particular, tends to be very, very expensive. So if you're going to make a decision to invest in new systems, you need to make sure that you understand the benefits and they are justified by the cost of what you're going to invest. So you might need to do some sort of analysis. And just to show how this sort of thing can work and to get you thinking through the sorts of issues you may need to deal with, we've got a lecture example, again focused around D. They are looking at a potential upgrade to their information systems. They are thinking about implementing a system that will allow customers to do various transactions, to book, to track packages and so forth, using their mobile phones or perhaps their other wireless device, such as a tablet PC. So the lecture example says, what are the things they'd need to think about? So what are some of the costs? What would the costs involved be? Because it's not necessarily just money, and what are the different things they might need to spend on? But what would the benefits be that they'd need to take into account? Now, you may or may not be able to actually put a financial value on these benefits. At the moment, we're not too worried about that. We're just thinking about what are the things they would need to take into account in making the decision. So see how many ideas you can come up with, and then press play when you're ready for the debrief. So what are the costs you need to take into account? And it's important to think as broadly as possible here, so you can generate the maximum number of points which you'd need for extra marks in the exam. Well, you'd start off by doing some market research, and that would carry a cost. So if you're going to even think about implementing this technology, you need to do some research into what the technology is, what the capabilities are, whether this is what customers are doing, whether this is what customers want, whether this is something customers would actually use. You'd also have to factor in the cost of doing the investment appraisal. So that presumably would involve staff that you employ, spending time doing the appraisal itself. There'd be the design and testing of the upgrade itself. You would probably hire IT experts, software company to do this for you. That would obviously carry a cost. And there may well be capital costs for new equipment. Nothing else, you would need some handheld devices to test this. And it may well be that you'd have to build additional server capacity to handle this sort of thing as well. There'd be the cost of actually informing your customers. There's no point in having this unless customers know about it, so you'd need to run some sort of campaign, maybe get people out on the road to go and talk to customers, demonstrate this, get them comfortable with using it. And you would probably have costs of supporting the new system. It is likely that there would be queries, there usually is with a new system, and you would need people on hand to maybe answer telephones and guide people through how to use these devices. There may also be costs in terms of lock-in. If you invest in this particular technology that's available now, it may be that you miss out on new technologies that are going to be available in a couple of years' time that perhaps are much better and much cheaper. So if you want to upgrade to the new technologies in a couple of years, you'll have to make another investment to do that. So that may be something that is difficult to do. Now, this is always going to be a factor because technology moves on all the time. It's not to say that you should never do an upgrade, but it is something you have to take into account in your decision making. So for all those costs, what might the benefits be? Well, hopefully you would be looking to reduce costs because people are actually using their mobile devices. There would be fewer calls to customer service staff. People can book and track things through their devices. They won't be ringing up your customer service staff. Over time, you will need fewer staff. That will be a cost saving. It should also give you a competitive advantage because it allows you to offer a better service to customers. The customers hopefully will find it very convenient to be able to do this. If they're out on the road, they can check what's happened to their deliveries or something like that. And if that's something that customers value, this should lead to new customers, to winning new business, or at very least retaining customers. It depends a little bit whether your competitors are offering this technology as well. If they're not, and you're doing something really leading edge here, it might well allow you to win new business. If your competitors are doing it, it might mean that you don't lose them to those competitors. So either way, it will either result in increased revenue or it will reduce the fall in revenue. So those are the costs and benefits you take into account. As I mentioned before, some of these you may be able to put a value on reasonably accurately. So for example, the capital costs of the new equipment, you should be able to estimate that reasonably accurately. But how much new revenue is it going to lead to in terms of competitive advantage? That's going to be very, very hard to estimate. But it is something you'll need to take a view on and take into account in your overall decision. In this syllabus, we do touch on some aspects of how you can organize the IT function, and particularly we look at outsourcing, whether it's a good idea for organizations to outsource their IT function as well as perhaps some of their other support functions. Now bear in mind this doesn't have to be all or nothing, and in fact most organizations who do this will outsource a part of their IT function. So maybe they outsource the support help desk perhaps, or disaster recovery, or maybe they get experts in to develop some new systems for them. Now, whichever one of those you do, that can bring risks. So the lecture example asks you to identify, just think through, what are the key risks in this specific situation? So you're outsourcing some or part of your IT function. What are the key risks and how can they be managed? So it's a fairly typical question structure. What are the risks? How can they be controlled? This sort of thing has been tested from time to time. So have a go at thinking of some important risks of outsourcing your IT function, and also what are the sort of controls you'd expect to see in place to deal with those, and then press play when you're ready to continue. So what are the key risks we can identify here? Well, perhaps one of the most obvious ones is that we lose some flexibility. If you have an outsourced provider with a certain contract providing a certain service, then you're not able just to change that the way you could do if the whole thing was being provided in-house. If it was in-house, you just make the change. If it's outsourced, you've got to negotiate changes to the contract. It becomes a lot more complicated process. There's also a risk that you get poor quality service, and it can be harder to deal with if it's being provided by another party compared to being provided internally, when it can be a performance management issue that you can deal with. There's a risk perhaps of supplier failure. If you outsource a major part of your IT services to someone else and they go bust, they fail, you've got a big problem on your hands. There is a risk perhaps that you have poor management of your supplier. Maybe it's not their fault, maybe they're the right supplier, but they're just not being well communicated with, they're not being well directed. There's a risk perhaps of lock-in, that you have a supplier that you really want to change, they're not good enough, but you can't because it's been a complicated process to do the outsourcing, they have the expertise, it's going to be a very difficult process to switch it to someone else, so you've just got to stick with them and put up with substandard service. That is another risk. And there's also perhaps a risk of reputational damage if you have a poor supplier, particularly if they're doing anything at all that is customer facing. There is perhaps a risk that their underperformance might reflect badly on you. So what controls can we put in place to deal with these? Well, actually, a lot of these risks can all be reduced by one very important control, which is having a good supplier selection process. It's a bit like recruiting an employee. If you recruit the right people, then you are very unlikely to have problems further down the line. If you're recruiting the wrong people, you're going to have loads of problems, and that's why the recruitment process is so critical in organizations. And similarly, choosing a supplier like this is a critical process. You've got to be really careful, you've got to make sure you take up customer references, you've got to have a thorough process and make sure you get the right supplier, and that way these sorts of problems are much less likely to arise. So that's a very important control throughout. In addition, in terms of the loss of flexibility, another control you could have is to have a clear change control process. So if you do want to make changes, it doesn't degenerate into some sort of very difficult negotiation. There is a clear procedure you go through. You know exactly who you need to talk to. You know how these things can be dealt with and negotiated, and you agree that up front. Risk of poor quality service. The very common control is to have in place a service level agreement, or an SLA. So the service level agreement for this sort of contract is normally very detailed and lays down exactly what the expectations of the provider are. And quite often that SLA will be reviewed, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, and sometimes the outsourced provider will actually have to pay penalties if they haven't met it. Risk of supplier failure. Best way of controlling against that is to do really thorough financial analysis of their financial statements at the time you're doing the selection and subsequently. So every year or so you need to be looking at their financial statements, checking that your supplier is financially stable, is not likely to go bust. Risk of poor management of the supplier. This is really a matter of recruiting or training your staff appropriately. So make sure you have people with expertise in supplier management. It is a particular skill. It's not necessarily something everyone can do. So if you haven't got those skills, maybe you need to hire someone who's good at it. Risk of lock-in to a supplier. Well, maybe you need to have a process allowed for in your contract to change supplier, a sort of exit clause. So it's not just unthinkable, it's something that can be done, and as far as possible you've thought in advance about how it might work if it does need to happen. In terms of the reputational damage to having a poor supplier, in a sense all of the above things will contribute to controlling this. You may also want to diversify your suppliers. It may be, particularly if it's anything customer facing, that you want to have more than one supplier involved and have a little bit of internal competition. Now that might be more expensive, you might lose out on some economies of scale that way, but maybe you judge that it's worth it. Now there is an alternative approach that you need to be aware of. It's been referred to once or twice in exam questions. You may decide that actually you don't want to completely outsource your IT, but you do want to allow for the economies of scale that can come with outsourcing. This is perhaps true particularly if you're a large multinational organisation, you've got lots of operations all over the world. You don't really want them all to have their own IT function. That's not efficient. What you'd really want is to have one or two large IT functions where you can have expertise concentrated, you can get economies of scale. So what organisations sometimes do is establish a shared service centre, which then provides IT services, or sometimes HR or finance services or similar support functions, provides those services to organisations maybe all over the world or all over the country who do fairly similar things. So examples in the private sector, companies like BP, who have lots of operations all over the world, have shared service centres to provide support centres, and also the NHS in the UK does something similar, providing support to hospitals and other NHS bodies. Usually there is a service level agreement in place within the organisation, and that ensures that the shared service centre delivers service to a level that's required. And compared with outsourcing, you're probably retaining a greater level of control because you are actually keeping the operation in-house instead of giving it to someone else. In this chapter, we've looked at the role of information and information systems and some of the risks associated with it. Key starting point here is that organisations need good information if they're to carry out their strategy, and they particularly need to focus on their critical success factors, the things that they need to get right in order to succeed. They will generally require information to get right and to make sure you're getting them right. There are three aspects to an information strategy. The information strategy is how you get the information that you need. That includes your information systems strategy, your IS strategy, which is about what information we need, your IT strategy, about how you're going to get that information, and your information management strategy, about who is going to be involved in managing the information and making it accessible. Managers are generally going to need different types of information depending whether they're at strategic or senior management level, tactical or middle management level, and operational or supervisory levels. There's different sorts of information they'll be looking for. There are a number of different types of system. Perhaps the really critical ones to understand for this paper are the ERP system that goes across the whole enterprise, decision support system, how you can do data analysis and scenario modeling to help with management decision making, and expert systems which can actually make simple decisions based on rules and based on data. You may need to look at cost-benefit analysis, some potential overlap with F3 here, where perhaps you need to do an investment appraisal, looking at the value of information, how is it really going to benefit us, and what is the cost going to be. And it may not be obvious what sort of value you should put on that. It may come down to an issue of judgment. And then in terms of organising your IT function, you just need to be aware of some of the issues around outsourcing your IT function, or maybe part of your IT function, which is a very popular approach, does bring additional risks, but you can put controls in place to deal with that. And an alternative is to use a shared service centre, whereby you keep it in-house and avoid some of the difficulties